In this video, we will look at the Confirmation of Cooperation and Representation form. The purpose of this form is to identify the parties involved in the transaction, for example, who is the buyer, who is the seller, and which brokerages and representatives are involved, and to describe how the brokerages and representatives will cooperate. It also outlines how the client will be represented by the brokerage and how commissions will be paid. The Confirmation of Cooperation and Representation form must be completed for every real estate transaction, whether it be residential or commercial, or purchase or lease. It will be completed at the time of writing the offer. Let's dive in and look at a few scenarios and see how you would complete this form in each scenario. So first, let's look at a scenario where there are two separate designated representatives from two different brokerages, each representing their own client. At the top of the form, list the buyer and seller's names and the property address for the transaction. Then in section 1, you'll need to describe the role of the listing brokerage in this transaction. For this scenario, since the listing brokerage is solely representing the seller, check box 1A. Then check the first option. Neither the seller brokerage nor a designated representative of the seller brokerage is representing the buyer and has not entered into a representation agreement with the buyer. So this is just saying that the listing brokerage is representing the seller and they don't have any representation agreement with the buyer. Then we would leave the next section blank as there's no multiple representation in this situation. Scroll down to section 4, and here is where we will describe the role of the cooperating brokerage in this transaction. For our scenario, we'll select 4A. The cooperating brokerage or a designated representative of the cooperating brokerage represents the interests of the buyer. So again, that's basically just saying that the cooperating brokerage is representing the buyer client in this transaction. Next, we need to describe how commission will be paid. The standard method is just to select box 1 and enter the commission percentage to be paid. If, however, you have a unique commission structure, then you can select option 2 and describe the terms of payment here instead. For example, if you need to reduce your commission, then you could indicate that here. You would click and open the text box and then write in your clause. So here we've written the listing brokerage will pay the cooperating brokerage a commission of 2% plus HST to be paid from the amount paid by the seller to the listing brokerage. So basically you can do either option. Box 1 is the more common scenario, but just make sure you choose one or the other and make sure the commission is clearly described. Next, you would have all parties initial at the bottom of page 1 and then move down to the brokerage information section. So in this case, we are representing the buyer, so we put our brokerage information in the cooperating brokerage section, and the seller brokerage is Keller Williams, so their information goes there. Again, there's no multiple representation in this scenario, so we can just leave that blank. And finally, at the end, have all the parties sign the form. Now let's look at a scenario where you're working with a self-represented party. So in this example, you will be working with a seller client. You're representing the seller, and your seller is accepting an offer from a self-represented party. So we just have to make a few small changes here. Firstly, under section 1 about the seller brokerage, instead of selecting the first box, you would select the second option, which states the seller brokerage or a designated representative of the seller brokerage is providing assistance to the buyer, and the buyer is a self-represented party. So this is just stating that you are representing the seller, but you're providing limited assistance to the buyer, and the buyer is representing themselves. And then, since the buyer is a self-represented party, there is no cooperating commission to be paid, so you can just leave the commission section blank. Then at the bottom of the form in the brokerage information section, fill out the information for your seller and your brokerage under the seller brokerage information section, but leave the cooperating brokerage information blank because, again, there is no cooperating brokerage. And then finally, have the buyer and the seller sign and date at the bottom of the form. Now, when dealing with a self-represented party, you must do more than just complete the Confirmation of Cooperation form. Firstly, even though they aren't your client, you must provide them with a copy of the RICO information guide and explain the guide to them. Also have them sign the form to acknowledge that they've received it. And then next, you need to complete the Information and Disclosure to Self-Represented Party form. This is super important. It explains the significant risks of self-representation and clearly states that you do not represent the self-represented party's best interests. Any assistance that you provide them is strictly in service of your own client. So to fill out this form, it's very straightforward. At the top, just enter the brokerage name, and your RICO registration number. Add the property address. and sign the form yourself. Then once you've signed it, explain the clauses to the self-represented party, and then they need to sign the bottom to acknowledge that they've received the disclosure and that they understand the nature of the relationship. Now, another example with a self-represented party would be if you are representing a buyer client, so you have a representation agreement with your buyer client, and your buyer wants to place an offer on a for sale by owner property. That means that the seller is a self-represented party. So in this case, you would not fill out section 1 because again, there is no seller brokerage, but you would scroll down and select box 3B. Now, this section is actually new as of 2026, and it states the brokerage or designated representative of the brokerage represents the buyer, and the brokerage will be paid according to the commission agreement entered into between the buyer and the seller. So, this states that the commission is defined on a separate commission agreement, which means that we do not enter any commission information here on this confirmation of cooperation form. Simply leave section 4 blank. Then, on your commission form, you would specify the terms of commission by either entering the percentage that you'll be paid or entering a flat rate of commission. Make sure to complete all fields and have both the buyer and the seller sign and date at the bottom of the form. Then, returning back to the confirmation of cooperation form, the buyer, seller client, and yourself would initial the appropriate bubbles, and you would then write your brokerage information in the buyer brokerage section at the bottom of the form. Leave the seller brokerage section blank. Finally, have all required parties sign at the bottom of the form. And now remember, when you're representing a buyer who's interested in a for sale by owner property, the same rules apply. Make sure that the self-represented seller receives both the RICO guide and the information and disclosure form before you proceed with any negotiations. And finally, let's look at a situation where you're involved in multiple representation. There are two ways that multiple representation can occur. Firstly, if operating under brokerage representation, remember the entire brokerage and all of its agents are bound by the same duties to the client. So, if a brokerage operating under brokerage representation had a buyer and a seller client, or two competing buyer clients in the same transaction, they would be under multiple representation. Under designated representation, the brokerage can actually have multiple clients in the same transaction, since each client will actually have their own designated representative assigned to advocate for their needs. Zolo operates under this designated representation model. However, even under this designated model, multiple representation still occurs when a single agent acts as the designated representative for both the buyer and the seller, or for multiple competing buyers for the same property. Now, multiple representation is always strongly discouraged because of the inherent risks associated with this type of transaction. But if you do find yourself in a multiple representation scenario, there are some important changes that you need to make to your form. So instead of completing section 1, the seller brokerage, you would leave that blank and then come to section 2, seller brokerage multiple representation. And here you would check box 2B to indicate that you are the designated representative for both the buyer and the seller. And then under brokerage information, you would enter your brokerage information under the seller brokerage side and leave the cooperating brokerage side empty, since technically there is no cooperating brokerage. And you make sure that both the buyer and the seller initial in their respective bubbles in the consent for multiple representation section. And for multiple representation, obviously there is no cooperating brokerage, so you would leave section 4 blank. There is no cooperating commission to be paid out, so you don't need to outline it on this form. There's just the one brokerage involved in the transaction, representing both the buyer and the seller. Now, when a transaction involves multiple representation, in addition to the confirmation of cooperation form, you must also provide the proper disclosure forms. For buyer clients, use Form 326. That's the multiple representation, buyer acknowledgement and consent disclosure. At the top, enter the buyer's name, your brokerage name, and the property address. Then have the buyer initial the bubble that fits your specific situation. Let's break down the 4 options. Number 1, multiple representation and brokerage representation. This applies when a brokerage operates under a brokerage representation model. And remember, in this model, every agent is assumed to have knowledge of every client. If the brokerage represents both the buyer and seller, even with 2 different agents, it's multiple representation. And note that since Zolo operates under designated representation, you probably won't use this very often. The second option is multiple representation and designated representation. This occurs when a brokerage operates under designated representation, and that means that they assign a specific agent to a specific client. Under this model, you are required to maintain confidentiality and to act in the best interest of your client. However, if you are the designated representative for both the buyer and the seller in the same transaction, you would enter into multiple representation and you must initial this bubble. The third option is multiple representation and designated representation and brokerage representation. This sounds like a mouthful, but basically this applies when one party is under designated representation and the other is under brokerage representation. For example, if you are the designated representative of the buyer, but the seller is being represented by the brokerage as a whole without a specific designated agent, then you would initial this bubble. And finally, option 4 is multiple representation and competing buyers. You would have your client initial here when you are the designated representative for multiple buyers competing for the same property. So once that's complete, you would then use the comment section to clarify any unique details about your representation. Have the buyer initial the final bubble to confirm their consent to the multiple representation. And finally, sign the bottom yourself and have your buyer sign as well. Now, Form 325 is for the seller client, and it's nearly identical to Form 326 with only one key difference. There's no bubble for competing buyers. Since competing buyers only impacts the buyer side, that option is omitted. Otherwise, fill it out exactly as we did with Form 326 for the buyer client.